Well, I plan on using migrants to house tobacco because we definitely have a labor shortage here, and the migrants are just a good source of labor.
They're the only ones that's been there every day since we've started. They are quite a bit more expensive than what we encounter locally. They'll cost us about 50% more, sometimes double of what we normally pay local help.
Well, it's been great because the migrants have been in the tomatoes, and I took the locals to the tobacco field, and it's just all worked out. Everything's been done on time, and it's just much easier on everybody, and it's just been great.
I've enjoyed it. Started off first of the season, it was pretty rough because they hadn't seen tobacco knife or spear or barns or anything like that, and we had to teach them from the ground up. But it's been rewarding, and it's worked out real well.
Historically, the work of farming in Kentucky has been done by farm family members as well as workers from the neighborhood and local community. However, these traditional sources of labor appear to be less and less available. Consequently, many farmers are finding that local labor is more difficult to obtain and harder to rely on. This interferes with the planning, efficiency, and profitability of farming operations. In response to the labor shortage, some farmers have begun using alien migrant farm workers. These workers are typically Hispanic and follow a cycle of harvests from state to state and thus lack the community ties of the traditional tobacco worker. The use of this new kind of agricultural labor is new territory for many managers. It will require change, and change always means facing challenges. Farmers must learn how to manage this new labor force. This will include learning about ways of recruiting, training, keeping, and maintaining productive employees. It will also require managers to become familiar with the laws, rules, and regulations that apply to the use of different types of hired labor. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an introduction to some of the considerations in managing farm labor. Keep in mind, however, that the information provided does not carry the weight of law or replace legal advice. One of the first questions farmers must answer is, how much labor do you actually need? Farmers should know labor needs far in advance of actual use, so that the necessary workforce can be assembled.
Well, I think one of the main things, you really want to plan out your labor needs. Just how bad do you need people, and how much work you can give these people, because when they come up here, they want to work, and they're expecting to work. And so I think you need to figure out what you want, and then know how many people you're going to get.
When you start into using migrant help, you've got to realize that these people want to work every day, and just because the weather may not suit you or you don't feel like working that day, you've got to give them a job every day. That's probably one of the biggest problems I've seen other farmers encounter is they may want to lay off a day or two because of the weather. Maybe a cold front coming in or rain coming in, but these people expect to work if it's not raining.
For migrant labor, they want to be employed steady, full-time, and we find that we have to plan in the slack times to find something for them to do. And like when these first came, they didn't think we had any work. And after being here 4 or 5 weeks, we got to getting more hours a week, and we had plenty of work for them. And anyone that is looking in migrant labor needs to plan that to have full-time work for them.
When determining labor needs, one important source of help is your county extension office and your county extension agent for agriculture.
We can help the farmer at the county extension office to determine the number of workers that might be required for a particular crop or crops that he's going to be working with the migrants. So that is very important, is to determine the labor needs and the type of laborers that he will need in his operation.
In addition to knowing your labor needs, it's necessary to know the laws and regulations that apply to your workers.
There are laws that the federal government has passed to protect employees. And in the case of migrants, they have been isolated out of the society due to their constant moving and in some cases a lack of the English language. One of the laws that protects employees is the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA. That's been around since 1938. It deals with minimum wage, overtime, child labor, and record keeping. Minimum wage, of course, is a weekly thing, not a daily thing. If the employer is paying his employees by the piece rate, he doesn't have to pay the minimum wage except at the end of the week so that all their hours equal minimum wage. Overtime, in most cases in farmers in Kentucky, they do not have to pay overtime. Child labor is something that all farmers and all employers need to be very concerned with. Record keeping deals with their name, social security, general information dealing with hours worked, rate of pay, to ensure that everyone was paid according to what they should have been, to include deductions. Now, not every farmer has to pay minimum wage and the record keeping under the Fair Labor Standards Act. If a farmer has less than 500 man days in a given calendar quarter, then he does not have to comply with the Fair Labor Standards Act.
500 man days is roughly equal to about 6 full-time workers over 3 months. This is also the measure for whether a farmer must adhere to another set of regulations called the Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act. Also known as MSPA, it is an important federal law dealing specifically with agricultural employment and was designed to provide migrant and seasonal farm workers with assurances about pay and working conditions.
When the workers are hired or solicited and employed in a far state, they need to know exactly where it is they're going, what they're going to be doing, how much they will be paid, housing conditions, and transportation costs, if any. The worker has to be told how much he is going to be paid, not just at least minimum wage. They need to be told exactly. The same thing holds true with transportation and housing. Housing is not a requirement. However, these workers, since they're coming long distances and being paid very low, are normally provided housing. This housing, as well as the transportation, has to comply with safety standards. Transportation things such as insurance within certain requirements. On payday, the farmer in Kentucky, at least many of the smaller ones, have never provided receipts in the past. This law requires receipts. It must show the days worked, how much they worked, the piece rates, any legal deductions such as IRS or FLSA taxes.
Along with keeping records and submitting a few forms to the government, a key step is posting the required information in both English and Spanish.
There's other little things such as having a yellow poster, which many farmers have seen posted so that the employees know. There are things that should be posted in the housing so that they know the conditions under which they are being housed, as well as that they comply with all the other agreements and arrangements which have been made.
As just mentioned, providing housing for agricultural workers is not a requirement, but appears to be necessary in today's competitive labor marketplace.
We used motels this year, but I think if a person would buy some of these used house trailers and set them up on their farms and fix them, they don't have to be real fancy because they don't like the motels. They'd rather be out on the farm.
Many farmers who want to continue using migrant workers are planning housing on their premises. If a farmer uses enough labor to fall under MSPA guidelines, there are specific MSPA regulations concerning housing conditions. Otherwise, for smaller farms, state and local codes need to be followed. A third major set of regulations is the Occupational Safety and Health Act, also known as OSHA. Occupational safety and health includes federal and state regulations which assure safe and healthful working conditions. Family members are exempt from these regulations. Agricultural workers are also excluded if 10 or fewer workers are employed, unless they are in temporary labor camps. If more than 10 agricultural workers are employed, then drinking water, toilet facilities, and hand-washing facilities must be provided and made available for employees' use. Other regulations apply for more than 10 employees in such areas as hazardous substances, tractor operation, and first aid. While OSHA applies to any type of worker on large farms, the Immigration Reform and Control Act, IRCA, applies to all hired labor. The broadest effect of this act is that each employer, including farmers, must verify the eligibility of each employee to work in the United States by completing the Immigration and Naturalization Service Form I-9. There are no exemptions. The I-9 form must be completed for every employee. When the forms are filled out properly, farmers are protected from penalties for hiring illegal aliens. There are several types of agricultural workers, and knowing the differences is important for labor management. A seasonal agricultural worker is someone employed in agricultural work of a seasonal or other temporary nature who is not required to be absent overnight from his or her permanent place of residence. This is what you might call local labor. A migrant agricultural worker is someone employed in agricultural work of a seasonal or other temporary nature who is required to be absent overnight from his or her permanent place of residence. Under this definition, a migrant could be someone from the next county or from thousands of miles away. A special agricultural worker, known as a SAW worker, is an individual hired under the SAW program provisions of the Immigration Reform and Control Act. Under this program, illegal aliens who could prove previous work experience in the United States were allowed to gain legal status. Under the SAW program, workers are not restricted to agricultural jobs and are eligible to become permanent residents after a waiting period of several years. SAW workers have identification card numbers that begin with A9. Employers of SAW workers are required to fill out and send in quarterly reports on their workers. The H-2A program is also part of the IRCA law. It provides a way for farmers who anticipate a shortage of domestic workers to bring non-immigrant aliens to the U.S. to do temporary or seasonal agricultural work. The workers are restricted to work on the farms with which they are contracted for a predetermined amount of time at a wage set by the government, and then return to their home country at the end of the season. Prior to bringing in these H-2A workers, the government must certify that there is a labor shortage and adequate housing, and the employer must agree to hire local labor whenever it is available. As you can see, several federal agencies have varying degrees of influence on the agricultural labor situation through various laws, rules, and regulations. For example, there's the Department of Labor with the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Migrant and Seasonal Agricultural Worker Protection Act, and the Occupational Safety and Health Act. There's the Department of Justice with the Immigration Reform and Control Act, covering the SAW and H-2A programs. The Department of Health and Human Services includes Social Security, and the Department of the Treasury includes the Internal Revenue Service that administers tax regulations. One important note, there have been recent and major changes in federal and state legislation concerning withholding requirements for employers. To find out more about these tax-related requirements, you can contact the Internal Revenue Service and the Kentucky Revenue Cabinet. How do you go about getting the needed farm laborers? With the relative newness of migrant labor being used in Kentucky, there may be a need to recruit. You can do things on your own by going to where the labor is, or you can use a farm labor contractor. A farm labor contractor is a person who receives a fee for labor contracting work, but is not an agricultural employer, an agricultural association, or an employee of an agricultural employer or agricultural association. A farm labor contracting activity is the recruiting, soliciting, hiring, employing, furnishing, or transporting of any migrant or seasonal agricultural worker.
The farmer also has one other thing he should be very concerned with, and that is that the person he is dealing with, the farm labor contractor, is a person who has been registered with the Department of Labor and that he complies with all these same regulations, because the farmer can be jointly held responsible for anything that that contractor does wrong. He can do this by contacting the Department of Labor and ensuring that this person does have a registration number, as well as to ensure that this farmer is watching what this contractor is doing. He should obtain records from the contractor as to what he paid these employees.
There are practical as well as legal considerations in recruiting labor.
So far, it hasn't been that much of a problem to find the migrant help. Especially this year, we have a contact in Florida that will send us pretty much anything we want to use. They do try to keep them in groups of 5 or 10 to keep their costs down and to make it economical to send them up here.
While many contractors only provide the labor, others use crew chiefs that travel to the area with the workers.
I think some of them will come back on their own, but I think you still need to keep in touch with the crew chiefs, because that's the way they do it down south, and that's probably going to be our main way of doing it. I hope some of them come back on their own.
Another concern is the difficulty of communicating with migrant workers due to the language barrier.
It's a little hard to communicate, but we've learned a few words, and they know a little bit of English, and we can manage to get them up in the barn and get the job done. If they're willing to work, we can get the message over to them.
It's also important to consider cultural differences in managing migrant workers.
Well, I probably just started out by realizing that they were from a different country, and their cultures were naturally different than ours. Tried to realize that and put it in perspective with what they were going to be doing here, and just give them a little time to actually work into this environment, this work, and into my culture.
Being able to adapt to a changing business environment has always been a key to success. A manager who is willing and able to become informed about the new way of doing things will survive, and the business will prosper. Obviously, management is the key. Specifically, improved labor management is the critical element required for success in labor-intensive enterprises in Kentucky. This presentation has touched on a few of the major things to keep in mind relating to farm labor management and migrant labor. Labor should be an important part of your farm plan. You should discuss your labor strategies with informed farmers, farm specialists, and the appropriate government agencies. Your county extension office can also be a source of information, such as a series of fact sheets about farm labor. However, additional specifics need to be obtained from materials provided through the appropriate government agencies.